Committee will come to order. Our hearing today should help clarify some of the hard choices we face for our country's security with the coming budget cycle. We live in a time when fiscal problems and mounting debt coincide with unprecedented national security challenges in a volatile world. Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has enjoyed the freedom to act in our national interests anywhere on earth. Few nations in history have been so privileged, and few nations have thrived so well. But all of us should recognize that depending on the choices we make, we may be in the sunset of that era. The National Defense Panel cautioned that since World War II, no matter which parties control the White House and Congress, America's global military capacity and commitment have been the strategic foundation undergirding our global leadership. The way we resource the Department of Defense forms that strategic foundation of our global leadership. Today, experts from some of the leading think tanks in Washington will present their views on the budget choices facing us. All of them, I think, provide valuable insight into some of the threats and choices and different futures which this committee has been looking about. All are here to present the difficult options before us, and some of those difficult options range from the loss of important manpower and equipment to military bases to discarding strategic responsibilities. Dr. Kissinger said in the Senate testimony earlier this month that the United States has not faced a more diverse and complex array of crises since the end of the Second World War. Our task is to manage a difficult combination of external and internal pressures on our defenses and be true to the heritage which we have enjoyed. I'd yield at this point to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Smith, for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you have succinctly described the challenge that we face. We have an increasingly dangerous world with national security threats emerging in many different areas, from Russia to the Middle East and North Africa, obviously the ongoing struggle against ISIL in Syria and Iraq. It's a dangerous world. It's not just because we have fewer troops deployed now that we're out of Iraq and significantly drawn down in Afghanistan. There's no such thing as a peace dividend at this point. We're in the exact opposite position, facing an array of complex threats that are going to require, both resources and considerable creativity to figure out how best to confront. At the same time, we are in a budget crisis. If you went back 4 years and looked at the Department of Defense's projections, their FYDP, the 5-year plan, and then their 10-year plan, for what they expected they were going to have to spend and what they have now, it is substantially less, in large part because of the Budget Control Act, but also because of, government shutdowns and CRs and basically the significant budget dispute here on Capitol Hill. So, more complex, challenging problems, less resources. That's the challenge that we face, and we'll be very interested to hear from you all about how best you think we should confront that. Because it's at times like that when you really need to get smart. It's the famous quote, I think it was from Winston Churchill. I'll attribute it to him anyway. And gentlemen, we're out of money. Now we have to think and try to figure out how best to use that money. I will say just two final things about that. First of all, we could help ourselves enormously if we got rid of sequestration. I think there is a budget fight still to be had. The deficit is down significantly, but it is still substantial. The debt is still substantial. We need to figure out a solution to that, to get a 10-year plan going forward for the budget. But sequestration is just a horrible place to do that. And it's interesting to note that when sequestration was passed, when the Budget Control Act was passed in 2011, the goals that it set, it basically said that you had to achieve $1.5 trillion in deficit savings over the course of the next 10 years. You had to come up with a plan for achieving that by the end of 2011. We didn't, so sequestration became law. We have, however, achieved far more than the amount of savings that was called for in the Budget Control Act. But yet we are still stuck with sequestration. For number one is get rid of sequestration. But number two is, if we're going to have to live with it, and even if we get rid of sequestration, we still are going to have less money than thought we were going to have. We're going to have to start making some choices about programs, about personnel, about Guard and Reserve, about a whole array of things within the defense budget. And unfortunately, the default position of most members of Congress is to protect their own. You know, if you're thinking about shutting down a weapons system, well, if it's made in my district or located in my district, then I'm going to be against it. We're running up against the Guard and Reserve problem. Nobody wants to reduce anything in terms of personnel costs because of the political implications. But if we've got the budget we've got, we have to make some kind of choice. And I would submit that for those of us who serve in this committee, it is not our primary job to protect everything in our own districts. It is our primary job to protect the country. I'll give you a personal example. When I represented Joint Base Lewis-McChord, they have an ROTC program out there. College students who come out, like 3,000 in the summer, and you know, it's some business. And they wanted to move it to Kentucky. They being the Department of the Army, and you know, the local people freaked out, and everybody wanted us to, you know, stop this. And they came to me and said, "This must be stopped." And I was like, "Yeah, if DOD thinks this is the best thing to do, then we'll be okay at Lewis-McChord. There's other things to do, and let's not get in the way of everything that the Department of Defense wants to do for parochial reasons. Because if we do that, we paralyze their ability to make smart choices and adequately provide for the national defense." And I know many past chairmen have been fond of quoting the thing that's apparently down there on the front of our committee, Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 doesn't say make sure that as much defense money as is humanly possible comes into your district. It's not what it says. And in times like this, I think we need to be a little bit wiser about how we make those choices. So look forward to hearing from you what you think those choices ought to be. And if we don't like what the Pentagon is offering, what are the alternative suggestions? So with that, I yield back. Look forward to testimony.
I thank the gentleman. Let me welcome each of the witnesses. We start with Mr. Todd Harrison with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, who I understand Mr. Harrison is the one who ran the exercise that all of the organizations participated in. Then Dr. Nora Bensahel, who is currently a Distinguished Scholar at American University, but was with the Center for New American Security when this exercise took place. Mr. Ryan Crotty with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Mr. Jim Thomas with Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And finally, Mr. Thomas Donnelly with American Enterprise Institute, who used to be a staff member of this committee and was the last one to get his testimony in, I noticed, which there may be a connection. I don't know. But we really do appreciate each of you not only being here, but for putting the time, effort, and resources into analyzing these different budget options that are before us. And so with that, Mr. Harrison, and without objection, your full written statements of all of you will be made part of the record, and Mr. Harrison, you may proceed.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, I want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to testify today. Approximately 1 year ago, CSBA convened a group of scholars from 4 think tanks represented here today on this panel and asked them to develop alternative approaches to rebalance DoD's budget and capabilities in light of projected security challenges and fiscal constraints. I should note that the views and choices expressed through this exercise represent those of the people who participated and should not be construed as the institutional positions of their organizations. The purpose of our exercise was to foster a greater appreciation for the difficult strategic choices imposed by the Budget Control Act of 2011. The ground rules were that each team could vary its defense strategy as it saw fit, using the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance as a starting point. The teams used their own expertise to assess the future security environment and associated risk, and they were free to modify and reprioritize roles and missions for the military accordingly. The teams then used an online tool created by CSBA to implement their strategy and capability choices. CSBA's Strategic Choices tool allows users to quickly add and cut items from the current program of record using more than 800 pre-costed options. The tool allows the users to see the resulting budget and force structure impacts in real time. The tool, I should note, does not assess risk or make judgments as to the sufficiency or wisdom of one's choices. Such subjective assessments are better left to the experts here. We also limited the degree of choices available to the teams to impose some political reality. For example, we limited how quickly they could cut in strength in each of the services. We also did not give the teams the ability to count savings from additional efficiencies or compensation reform beyond what was already included in the President's budget request. And we did this for two reasons. First, the purpose of the exercise was to focus on the major strategic choices facing DoD, and while we all agree the department should always do more to pursue efficiencies, efficiencies do not typically rise to the level of a major strategic choice. Second, the President's FY16 budget request, which served as the baseline for all adds and cuts in this exercise, already assumed well over $200 billion in efficiency savings and compensation reform. Since this was already built into the baseline, the teams already had the benefit of these savings, and it would not be realistic to allow the teams to assume even more savings on top of these. And it also made the job harder for all of these guys. Each of the teams was asked to rebalance the DoD budget over 10 years, spanning FY15 to 24, under two different sets of budget constraints. The first set of constraints used the BCA budget caps currently in effect, and the second set used a slightly higher level of funding, roughly consistent with the President's FY15 request. Allowing the teams to vary their strategies and using two sets of budget constraints for each team allowed us to discern which choices were budget-driven and which were strategy-driven. For example, each of the teams made different choices with respect to the Marine Corps force structure, which suggests that these choices were dependent on the team's strategies. In other instances, such as the decision to retire active component A-10s, all of the teams made the same choice, which suggests this decision may be independent of strategy. We also looked for instances when individual teams made different choices under the two levels of budget constraints. For example, all of the teams made cuts to readiness funding under the full BCA budget constraints. But when the budget constraints were loosened, they changed their readiness cuts. This suggests that cuts to readiness funding were budget-driven. Conversely, we found that each team made roughly the same cuts to personnel levels, particularly civilian and support contractors, in the two budget scenarios, which suggests that these personnel cuts were not budget-driven. Despite the budget constraints imposed, all of the teams chose to make substantial investments in new capabilities, even though these new investments required them to make larger offsetting cuts in other areas. All of the teams, for example, increased spending on space, cyber, and communications capabilities. This suggests that the teams felt DoD's plans did not adequately address the challenges the military is likely to face in this area. Much has changed in the security environment since this exercise was conducted a year ago, but the long-term fiscal constraints of the Budget Control Act remain the same. What our exercise helps illuminate, and what my colleagues will speak to in their testimony, are the core capabilities the military must protect and, in some cases, increase investments in, regardless of the budgetary constraints imposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Beneschel?
Excuse me. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify in front of you today. I participated in this exercise when I was employed at the Center for New American Security as the co-director of the Responsible Defense Program. My co-director, retired Lieutenant General Dave Barno, and I formed the CNAS team. In the interest of time, let me quickly note the three most important conclusions we took away from our participation in the exercise. First, DoD is not investing in the right things for the future. As Todd mentioned, this exercise was not a budget-cutting drill. It truly was about making strategic choices. All four teams decided to rebalance the defense budget by reducing spending on many current priorities and reinvesting the newly freed funds into other parts of the defense budget. For example, our team cut the planned defense budget over the 10-year period covered by the exercise by a total of $716 billion, far more than was required to meet the spending caps, but added back $384 billion in new spending in the full Budget Control Act scenario and added $509 billion back in the half sequestration scenario. This suggests that the planned DoD budget is overinvested in some key areas and underinvested in others. Second, it was virtually impossible to meet the budget caps under the Budget Control Act without cutting civilian and military personnel, readiness, or both. Personnel and readiness simply consume so much of the defense budget that we were unable to stay within the budget caps by cutting procurement, force structure, armaments, and logistics alone. People in force readiness had to be sacrificed in order to stay within those caps. We chose first to cut the number of civilians employed by the Department of Defense and the military services by 1/3, which was the maximum we were allowed to do under the exercise. Between 2001 and 2012, the number of DoD civilians grew 5 times faster than the number of active duty military personnel. In our view, military combat forces, the sharp end of DoD's spear, needed to be preserved even at the cost of deeply slashing civilian staff and overhead. Yet even so, we were also driven to reduce the active duty and reserve end strength of all 4 military services. We cut active duty end strength by a total of 127,000 personnel, with most of those cuts coming from the active Army. And even yet, we still had to cut readiness in order to meet the budgeting caps, even though we strongly resisted doing so because readiness is expensive. We believe that the United States has a responsibility to prepare its military forces as thoroughly as possible for the missions that they are asked to conduct, and sending untrained or inadequately prepared forces into combat is dangerous and irresponsible. Yet we had to make the same difficult choice that the services have made in recent years to cut those readiness funds. Third and finally, defense reform is essential to free resources for current and future capabilities, again, to invest as much money as possible in the pointy end of the spear. There were 3 key elements of a reform agenda that stood out to us on our team. First, DoD must shed unneeded overhead, civilians, and contractors for the reasons I mentioned above. Second, another BRAC round is needed. Reducing excess infrastructure would have been one of our highest priorities if the tool had allowed us to do so. The Army and the Air Force have each estimated that they have around 20% excess capacity. It is unconscionable to require these services to continue spending money on facilities that they do not need, while the budget caps require them to cut end strength, training, and readiness, which puts American troops at risk. Third and finally, military compensation must be reformed. This is a hard but necessary choice because pay and benefits and health care are eating an ever larger share of the defense budget. The recent Military Compensation and Retirement Commission report offers good recommendations on how to do so while grandfathering all currently serving members of the military. The Commission has estimated that its proposals would save $15 billion a year. That amount is certainly not enough to compensate for the cuts required by the Budget Control Act. But if we had been able to include around that level of savings in the exercise, for example, which did not include an option for compensation reform, we would have had to cut far fewer people and maintain more readiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Crotty?
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. The strategy and budget exercise that we are referencing here today occurred almost exactly a year ago, and yet the world really already looks significantly different than it did then. The volatile and complex security environment already strains many of the choices that we made in this exercise, which I think speaks directly to the challenge of sequester-level budgets, which is a loss of flexibility and a limiting of options. The U.S. security goals have not been reduced since the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, and yet $120 billion has been cut from that concurrent budget over the 3 years since. The impact of these cuts are already in evidence, as the service chiefs have already testified, and with the force as currently constituted, continued sequester-level funding would shift the impacts the force is currently experiencing in readiness, trimmed programs, cut training, from just holding patterns to entrenched problems. So far during these budget cuts, we've asked the military to do more with less, and they've risen to that challenge, but that is not sustainable over the long term. In participating in this exercise, it was clear that sequestration forces you into decisions that you would not make otherwise. The CSIS team worked to tailor our cuts to the strategic priorities that we derived from the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, prioritizing homeland defense, Asia-Pacific engagement, presence, and reassurance, and retaining counterterrorism capabilities. We took as a guiding principle that a smaller, ready force was preferable to one that maintained force structure or added more new programs, but is less prepared to face the complex challenges we already face today. There was no way to implement this strategy without risk, and we took our primary risks in the size of active ground forces. We hedged this risk with increases to the Guard and Reserve, sought to facilitate reconstitution of a larger ground force by having an additional non-commissioned officers, junior grade field officers, retained better coordination of training between active and reserve, and shifting of some roles and missions into the reserve component. We also cut the carrier force, but forward stationed one in the Pacific to maximize coverage. And we invested in smaller, unconventional capabilities, including cheaper forward presence, more intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and special operations forces. Under the sequester level budget, the U.S. military will remain the preeminent military in the world. However, we have seen a shrinking of the breathing space that we have between the capacity that the force has and the daily demand on those forces. This limits the Pentagon's ability to react and adapt to new challenges and take on the shaping and reassuring activities that can help deter future conflict. The Pentagon is being forced to choose between the fights today and the fight tomorrow. The reality is that today's security challenges require capabilities for the full spectrum of operations. The 2016 budget process will be a critical one for national security. We're reaching a turning point where the temporary impacts of sequester-level budgets are going to more permanently shape the force that we have going forward. So hopefully today's testimonies will help the committee better understand what a force looks like under those budget constraints and inform the budget trade-offs that will have to be debated over the coming months. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Thomas?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you very much for holding this hearing today and also for inviting all of us to testify. I'll provide a brief overview of CSBA's approach during last year's Strategic Choices exercise. We started as well with an assessment of the external security environment and its implications for the types of forces and capabilities we will need in the future. This assessment, in essence, served as our filter or our lens for determining our priorities as well as where we would take risk, regardless of spending levels. As challenging as the prospect of continued spending caps are for national defense, we face an even more worsening set of challenges overseas. Revisionist states like Russia, China, and Iran, Islamist militant groups like ISIL, new nuclear powers, all of whom are exploiting a host of new technologies that confer the means to impede America's ability to project power and meet its security commitments in the ways it traditionally has done so. The bottom line for us as we assess these challenges was that the future was going to present far tougher challenges for our military than the post-Cold War era that we are exiting. In particular, future operating environments will be far more contested as adversaries exploit anti-access and area denial capabilities to devalue our traditional means of power projection and achieving forward presence. Thus, we saw an imperative to reshape DoD's portfolio of forces and capabilities around three main objectives. First, we sought to reshape the U.S. military to put more weight on deterrence through the prospect of swift punishment and more effective denial of our enemy's objectives in the first instance. And at the same time, relatively less weight on traditional compellence forces, that is, forces that we need to serve eviction notices when our allies or friends abroad might be invaded and we have to conduct a counter-invasion. Second, consistent with this first objective, we sought to maximize combat strike power and prioritize the most viable options for projecting power and holding potential adversaries at risk anywhere and any time. We maintained the nuclear triad. We placed a premium on conventional global surveillance and strike forces, including submarines and low-signature, long-range land and sea-based surveillance and strike aircraft, and made substantial increases in our stocks of precision-guided munitions. We sought to develop new ground-based strike systems. We prioritized unconventional power projection capabilities as well, including special operations forces and cyber and electronic warfare capabilities. And we invested in potential game changers like directed energy, electromagnetic railgun, and high-power microwave weapons. Second, we sought to judo throw the A2AD problem by fielding our own air and sea denial forces and helping frontline allies to do the same. So we built up stocks of sea mines, acquired new torpedoes, and developed new maritime sensor arrays to detect enemy intruders in friendly maritime space. We pursued new air and missile defense systems like the air-launched hit-to-kill missile, and we made substantial investments in decoys, deception measures, aircraft shelters, rapid runway repair kits to improve the resilience of our forward-based forces. And lastly, we expanded our combat logistics fleet to maintain robust naval strike power in distant theaters. Making these investments would be difficult in any circumstances, but the BCA caps made the shift even more difficult. We took risks. We took risks in traditional forces less suited for operations in contested environments, including those most dependent on close-in bases and those that have to mass in order to be effective. This meant significant reductions in legacy short-range combat aircraft and ground force capability. We also had to make very deep cuts in civilians and contractors. And with greatest reluctance, we were also unable to avoid making cuts in near-term readiness funding and had the most regret over this choice. In closing, I urge Congress to develop a serious budget proposal that properly funds defense while reshaping the U.S. military for tomorrow's challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Smith. It is an honor for a former staff member to return to this, to the People's House and to be on this side of the witness table for a change. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'll try to be brief. I think it's important, though, to say that we tried, this was a second run through this game for us, and we did not want to repeat the lugubrious experience we had the first time. To be constrained by the BCA budget levels or even the modified levels that we used the second time around was, we felt, simply to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. That there was no space for strategy when the budget choices were so constrained. And I think Todd's observation that there was a whole lot of commonality, another way to say that is there wasn't a dime's worth of difference between the BCA-constrained programs that the four of us came up with is an important takeaway from the exercise. At this level of budget, there really isn't much chance for a strategy to operate. Secondly, we also felt that we had to reject the President's 2012 defense guidance because it would not, in our judgment, achieve the national security goals that this country has always strived to achieve and most recently enunciated in the National Defense Panel. So we thought it was necessary to return to a more traditional military strategy, because what we wanted to do was to find out how far we'd fallen into the hole that we've built for ourselves over the past decade and what it would cost to get back out of that hole. So that's the approach with which we approached this game. And so very kindly, Todd and his crew allowed us to play a budget unconstrained version, which we used to try to put a price tag on what we thought it would take to return to a more traditional military posture on the part of the United States. And again, I won't go through that in detail. I'd be happy to respond to it in the question and answer session. But I would say that we also refuse to sort of rule out unpleasant forms of warfare, counterinsurgency and the like, and unpopular theaters of war, such as the Middle East. So we wanted to stick with a strategy that was consistent with the long past and not invent a new America that divested itself of traditional security interests. Rather, we wanted to put a price tag on attempting to return to a more traditional defense posture and to exercise a more traditional strategy, one consistent with the strategies that have been consistent from administration to administration, from changes of party, really since the end of World War II, but particularly since the end of the Cold War. And as my colleagues have observed, it's been a year since we ran the game, and the world looks a little bit more dangerous today than it did a year ago. We didn't fully understand how firm a grip ISIS would have on Western Iraq and Eastern Syria, or how serious the Russians were going to be about holding on and expanding their grip on Eastern Europe either. So if we were playing the game today, we would take the same approach, and that would be not to worry so much about the 20-year future, but to try now to rebuild, to get to the point where the investments that I think some of my colleagues were more interested in could have a decisive effect. We really felt that the critical time was now, and that our shortfalls in capacity and readiness were more strategically important than shortfalls in capability. So we wanted to try to repair what's now broken in order to survive, to live again, to fight another day. And just to give you a sense of what that meant to us, a couple of things. First of all, we didn't just simply throw money at everything. First of all, we understand that the rebuilding of the force and taking advantage and in rebuilding the industry and the infrastructure that would sustain that force has to be cognizant of the fact that these are institutions that have been on a starvation diet for some time now and overworked. We have built a plant, for example, that's capable of producing maybe 300 F-35s a year, but so far we've only been producing about 30 a year. So while the plant is there, the workforce isn't there. So when we were reinvesting, we tried to be cognizant of how much money the department could intelligently digest over the 10-year period that we were talking about. So we didn't think that just flipping the money switch was going to be an adequate solution. Nonetheless, over 10 years, we calculated the difference between the BCA levels of spending and what we thought might begin to reduce things to a manageable level of risk was $780 billion. That's a lot of money. By the same token, we were surprised to understand that not even that level of further investment would restore the program to what it was prior to the BCA. Let me repeat that. In other words, we couldn't get back to where we were in terms of what the defense program was in 2011, 10 years from now, even if we added almost $800 billion to the defense program. So that's a measure of how deep the hole is that we have dug for ourselves. Final metric, that level of spending, the budgets that we imagined at the end of this reinvestment period would still be less than 4% of projected GDP. And to the degree that the 4% of GDP figure means anything other than a level of affordability, it means that even this kind of reinvestment would still be below what reasonable people imagine would be a sustainable level of defense burden for the economy and our society. So the big takeaway for me was, in order for us to restore a traditional form of American leadership, it's going to cost a lot of money. It'd still be affordable, but we can't get there from here. Thank you.
That wasn't very cheerful. So in essence, 4 of the leading institutions in town formed teams to look at how you would reprioritize the defense budget. And as each of you, I think, has acknowledged, a fair number of things have happened in the last 12 months. Crimea and Ukraine, ISIS, these negotiations with Iran. North Korea says it's testing various systems. The Chinese in waters close in the Western Pacific are more aggressive. So my one question I would ask for each of the 4 teams is hold yourself accountable. Knowing what you know now has happened over the last year, where did you mess up? What would you do? What would be the 1 or 2 areas you would do differently now than you did then based on these events that have happened over the last year? So, Dr. Bensahel, would you like to start?
Sure. An easy question.
Sorry.
I think that the guiding principles that we used during the exercise were the fundamental question is, where do you assign risk, right? Because all of strategy is about assigning risk. We made a calculation to assign more risk in the short to medium term than in the longer term because of some of the challenges, as Jim mentioned, because we saw some very significant threats coming out on the horizon. And therefore, we prioritized investments in advanced military capabilities and research and development because of the long lead times those involve. I don't think we would have made very many fundamentally different choices given what we know now about what's happened over the past year. The one area where I think we might have made a different choice is we might not have cut active duty Army end strength by quite as much as we did. In the exercise, we cut it down from the planned level of 490,000 to 420,000. I think we would maybe have made a different choice to cut that only as far as about 450,000 to hedge against some of those threats. But we still would be changing the balance of the force between the active and reserve, even in the Army, and still trying to preserve as much money as we could for those long-term investments given our strategic principles that we use to guide the exercise.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Carney?
So we actually tried to focus a little more on the near term, and that was something that was borne out, and yet still I think we were underinvested in the kinds of reassurance and low-end deterrence that actually has been shown is something that we desperately need, whether it's in Europe or in Asia, and I think that that is something that can only be done with more capacity. You need more people out there engaging with partner and allies, having the flag, being available, being close by, because I think that really provides a reassurance that is required, especially at the lower end. You know, we are very good at deterring at the high end, and something that we'll have to continue to invest in to maintain that. But that has changed the level of the conflict, the discourse, and that has not looked very good over the past year. So for us, so even having focused more on that near term, I agree with Nora. It was primarily in some of those personnel cuts that we made. We cut the Marines, and I think we now definitely regret that, particularly with their sort of more unique capabilities, as well as the requirements that are being put on them in sort of the new normal environment. There's a lot that we need from them, but also I think we did not say this specifically, but I think that based on the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, we would have been pulling some of those Army units that we cut out of Europe, and that immediately comes to mind as something that might have been a dangerous decision. So as you said, I think it immediately tells you that there are significant choices that can change in just the course of a year, how those will impact your future security.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas?
One of the things that really strikes me, Mr. Chairman, is we look back over the past year, has been this growing trend in sub-conventional creeping aggression, whether it's little green men in Ukraine, or it's fishermen and the use of paramilitary coast guards in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, the use of the Quds Force in the Middle East. This looks like it's a growing trend, and I don't think it's a question of do we deal with anti-access and area denial threats or we deal with creeping aggression. What I see is really the confluence of the two, is that anti-access and area denial capabilities are providing umbrellas that make it easier for revisionist states to conduct creeping aggression activities in their immediate regions. Fundamentally, this is about the weakness of frontline states. As we look around the periphery of Eurasia, from East Asia to our friends and allies in the Middle East to Europe and countries in the Baltics and elsewhere, how do we strengthen their capabilities and ability, especially to deter sub-conventional threats? I think we need to place more emphasis on foreign security assistance, and in particular, think if there are ways that we can further expand or strengthen our unconventional warfare capabilities for countering some of these threats. So I think special operations have an incredibly important role to play, and that would be one of the things I'd want to look at again. ISR is another. I think what we're seeing on a global basis is inadequate ISR capacity to deal with multiple crises simultaneously. And the last is, as I mentioned earlier, we already have regrets about readiness, and that cuts in readiness under BCA caps are deleterious to our ability to deal with all of these situations. Thank you.
If I can interject for just a second, just to remind members that tomorrow we have an informal roundtable on exactly this topic. What'd you call it? Creeping aggression. Unconventional, hybrid warfare, lots of names, but we need to understand this better and see whether we have whether we're able to deal with it, and we have outstanding folks to come and visit with us about it tomorrow. Mr. Donnelly, you kind of answered this, but I don't know if you have some additional comments.
I have no regrets, Mr. Chairman. I think the events of the last year really underscore our fundamental approach, that the near-term crisis is so immediate and taken in the aggregate. It is a global crisis. There's no theater, there's no domain of warfare in which American strength isn't being seriously called into question. So again, it really sort of underscores two things to me, that the crisis is now, and that the fundamental strategy that was defined in 2012, however wise it may have seemed then, is not responsive to current conditions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith.
And I guess the big question is, where do we save money? And a couple of you mentioned a few things, but if we could just really emphasize again, there's a laundry list of things that the Pentagon has put out there: BRAC, personnel cost savings, getting rid of the A-10, laying up various Marine and Navy ships. Give me your three best ideas for saving money that fit within the national security challenge that we have.
Well, sir, I would start by noting some of the things that we took off the table are probably the place that we should actually start. Compensation reform. We did allow base closures in the exercise, but we made it realistic. Base closures cost you a little money up front and then save you money in the long run. Every single team here chose to do base closures under both budget scenarios. So I think that's an important takeaway from this exercise. But ultimately, having run 2 of these exercises with this group of think tanks and dozens of exercises with other groups, the common trend that I've found is that in almost every single case, every team, the largest amount of savings dollar-wise comes from personnel. Military personnel, active and reserve component, and civilian personnel that work for the DoD.
And specifically on those personnel savings, there's a bunch of different areas. There's healthcare, there's compensation, there's pensions, and then there's a variety of different benefits: housing, commissaries. What makes the most sense, and where do you get to the point where you fear that you're risking the all-volunteer force, the willingness of people to sign up?
In the exercises, it all came from cutting headcounts. But I'll say, in my own opinion, having studied and written about this issue, I think what the Compensation Commission came out with in their final report at the end of last month, I think that they've got a sound approach there. It certainly, could use some tweaks and improvement by Congress, but their 2 main recommendations that affect the DoD budget are to alter the current retirement plan to add a 401k-like plan that would benefit 75% of people who leave without any retirement savings, while maintaining the defined benefit plan for people who serve a full career and retire.
How does that save money?
Well, so the commission's plan, using their own numbers, once fully implemented, it would save about $2 billion a year, which is not a lot from that one change, but it basically saves money by DoD not having to set aside as much in an accrual payment each year to the Military Retirement Trust Fund, and taking some of those savings and reinvesting in a defined contribution plan like a 401k, but banking the rest of the savings. The other main recommendation of the commission that saved more money was a change to the healthcare system and allowing active duty dependents, reservists, and retirees to do something they were calling TRICARE Choice, where you would get a basic allowance for healthcare for active duty dependents, for example, and they could buy into commercial health insurance plans instead of remaining on the military healthcare system. That change, when fully implemented, according to their own estimates, would save a little over $6 billion, almost $7 billion a year once it was fully implemented. Just those 2 changes alone in the Military Compensation Commission report would save about $33 billion in aggregate over the next 5 years, and more than that in every 5-year period that comes after it. $33 billion is a good amount of money. It does not get you all the way where you'd have to be in terms of the Budget Control Act, but it certainly would help.
Just one quick question. Anyone can take this. Weapons systems. Give me a reasonably expensive weapon system that you think we don't need? That we can live with 8 carriers instead of 11. We don't need the new Ohio-class submarine. We can buy half as many F-35s. Give me a major weapon, because I think by some estimates, the weapon systems that we are planning on building right now, we can't afford, barring for some unforeseen acquisition reform miracle. So something's got to go. What would you say should go?
I think that's exactly the right question to ask, and the obvious answer to us when we ran through this exercise is the F-35. That is the procurement program that is eating the entire defense budget alive, particularly the Air Force budget, but its costs are so high that it's crowding out everything else in the procurement area as well.
So it's possible to consider basically eating, at this point, close to 20 years worth of expenditures on the F-35, and then simply relying on, I get my generations mixed up here, 3rd or 4th generation fighter planes.
No, we didn't recommend canceling the program. F-35s are needed by the Air Force in the future, but in particular, the Air Force doesn't need as many of them as it says it needs. The number that the Air Force originally came up with of 1,746 F-35s was derived by doing a one-for-one replacement with the current fighter fleet. And so if the F-35 is supposed to have, and it does have, all these additional capabilities, it's not clear to me why the one-to-one number is the right force structure for the Air Force, for example. Again, because of the constraints of the exercise on our team, we did also cut some Navy ships. We cut cruisers, we cut a couple of destroyers, and we did cut an aircraft carrier, although, again, a lot of that was budget-driven more than strategy-driven. And we ended up cutting a lot of force structure in the services, again, particularly in the Army, but because that reflected our personnel cuts, it doesn't make any sense to try to keep the force structure in the headquarters if you're cutting the personnel. So we did cut some brigade combat teams, some force structure in the Marines, but again, that reflected our primary decision because of the budget caps to cut the personnel to then shrink the force structure in proportion to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Or someone else.
Yeah, look, I just think you need to have a larger aperture when you start going down this road. Just suppose, for example, you're concerned because the F-35 is a huge program. What sense does it make to have, if you're going to cut the F-35s for the Navy, what sense does it make to have the big deck carriers? Who wants a $5 billion, $7 billion carrier with a 30-year-old airplane that can't go very far or carry very much on it? It's not like the F-35 is, a miracle weapon for the carrier, but the carrier without a better airplane on it doesn't make any sense. So you have to take the force. Likewise, why should the Marines buy large deck America-class amphibs, which was designed for the F-35? The whole boat is designed to accommodate the F-35. Also, the force numbers are not necessarily capability numbers. They're force generation numbers. You may have to have 1,700 Air Force F-35s in order to generate a certain number in a certain number of theaters. I mean, I don't know that arithmetic couldn't be revisited. But again, if you're worried about covering all the bases that we have to cover, you have to generate a force that's there. Capability, we haven't invented a capability for any platform to be in 2 places at once. So the numbers make a certain bit of sense, and if you just start taking them in the abstract, you're going to end up doing exponential damage rather than arithmetic damage, and the pieces of the force interact with one another. So this is what budget drills lead to that have second and third order consequences that we see reflected in the headlines every day, but we don't really take into account when we go through these sort of budget drills.
Thank you. I've used up quite a bit of time here. I want to yield back.
So do budgets. It's not just budget drills that have second order effects. Real budgets do too. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel for all the work you've done to help enlighten us to make some very hard and difficult decisions forthcoming. I wanted to ask you that if we continue to go down this road of policing the world, and there is a need with these attacks from ICE and groups like that, and yet we here in Congress are having to make some very difficult budget cuts, not just as it relates to the military, but to other programs for the American citizen. I think that's why today with your testimony is very important, because again, we will be making these decisions in the next few months. I somewhat get perplexed with the fact that I'll use, for an example, Afghanistan. John Sopko, the Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, has testified before subcommittees and a full committee oversight that so much of the money we're spending in Afghanistan is a waste. It ends up in the hands of the Taliban to buy weapons to kill Americans, or the Taliban decides that a road that we built, they want to blow it up. I know this wasn't part of your responsibility, but I got to get to a point. If we continue to do this policing work around the world, and then we decide that, yes, we fought, our men have died and given their life and limbs, but we're going to still stay there and help them rebuild their country. The bilateral security agreement with Afghanistan is 10 more years at an average of anywhere from $25 million to $40 million. I mean, it's just on and on and on. Then you testify here today that we're not going to have the strong military that we need because, again, money's going to be part of the issue. Yes, there is waste. You acknowledge that in the Air Force and the Army. I think 20% you said maybe was excess. There are things we can do and should do. But I want to get to the point now of the question. In your analysis and your personal opinion, is there not going to be a time that the Congress pass a war tax to pay for what we have and what we need to keep this country militarily strong? Because I just don't think we can continue to go down this road, quite frankly, without a collapse. So my point is why the Congress does not have a debate, and maybe we will have a debate, on the fact that maybe we need to debate a war tax or some type of taxation to make sure that we are not cheating our defenses from being strong enough to protect this country. Do you believe sincerely at some point in time, and maybe this is a little bit off your responsibility, but I'd like to know your personal opinion, that if we continue to go down this road, we cannot keep doing business as we're doing it now because we're not paying for it. It just is ongoing and ongoing to a point that we won't have any more money. Is this fair to say that Congress should have this kind of debate so we can answer some of the, have some solutions for some of the areas that you've shared with us today that are going to be problem areas in the days to come?
I would just respond that, I fully agree that we as a nation need to have a debate on what it is we want our military to be able to do. And that is where we began the exercises by each of these teams having that debate amongst themselves on exactly what are the right roles and missions for the military now and into the future. Once we have that debate, then we need to do the hard work of figuring out what it is we need in our military in terms of capability, capacity, and readiness in order to execute those roles and missions that have been assigned to the military. And once we know what resources would then be required, then as a nation we need to be willing to pay for it. And if that means additional revenues by some means, then so be it. But that is the debate that we should be having.
Congressman, if I could just add to Harrison's remarks, I think in addition to a national debate about what we need our military to do, I think we also need a much greater dialogue with our allies and partners overseas. I think it's not just a question of what do the American people pay, but what more can our allies be doing in various places?
I'll be very brief, if I may. If the question is about how to finance military power and the conduct of war, historically, these are the reasons that countries have national banks and borrow money, not to support current entitlements, not to pay for current, recurring domestic expenditures. The British national debt during the Napoleonic Wars was something like 250% of GDP per year, yet because that was a public good, the markets of Europe were willing to finance that, and eventually the British retired that debt. We're doing precisely the opposite right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the gentleman. I realize it's hard with 5 witnesses to stay within 5 minutes, but if members can keep their questions briefer, then we might have a chance. Mr. Moulton.
I have no questions at this time, Mr. Chairman, but thank you all very much for participating in this incredibly important discussion.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In reading your testimony, I wondered if you thought there was any fat in the defense budget.
There are things that I wouldn't necessarily buy. I'm not sure I would call them fat. I don't think that's really a useful
So what would
thing.
they be?
There were things I would reinvest in and not invest in at the moment. I think, for example, although the littoral combat ship is a great littoral combat ship, it's not a very good frigate. So the problem is not the ship per se. It doesn't make it a fat ship, although unfortunately the Navy made it way.
Too heavy?
Yes, yeah, okay. So, but the problem is a bad analysis of the mission and the need, or a changing international environment. There's nothing wrong with the program per se or the technologies per se. It's just too small to be a frigate. So it's the wrong weapon. It's not it's not that this was fat or government waste, fraud, and abuse.
Thank you. The National Defense Panel, with members appointed by this very committee, concluded that, quote, a recapitalization of the nuclear triad under current budget constraints is, quote, unaffordable. Yet the President's budget is asking us to overhaul our arsenal, costing $1 trillion over the next 30 years, money that could be spent on dozens of other national security concerns. Before we move forward with this overhaul, do we need to reevaluate our assumptions and goals of our nuclear deterrent? I'd like to know your thoughts on how we juxtapose that with the budget. Mr. Harrison, why don't you start?
As a budget analyst, I always cringe at the term affordability because, the things that we're talking about here today, some of them are very expensive, no doubt. But affordability is a choice, right? It's a matter of whether or not we're willing to make the resources available. I think when I look at the nuclear triad, my conclusion is that it's not yet ripe for a decision. If you look at the $1 trillion projection, it is over 30 years. We will likely spend 15 to 20 trillion on defense over that same time period. So it is a rather small part of our overall force and expenditures. And many of the platforms included in the nuclear triad that we're going to need to recapitalize are dual use. And especially many of the supporting capabilities in terms of communication networks, tankers for the aircraft. Many of these things we would fund anyway, even if we had no nuclear weapons in our arsenal. I think you get to a good point, though, of do we need to rethink the triad? Do we need to rethink the way that we modernize it and the type of capabilities that we have in there? I think absolutely we need to be looking at it, and the time to look at it is between now and the end of the decade, and then we can start making some smart decisions. The one thing that concerns me most about the recapitalization of the nuclear triad is we have put off some of these recapitalization efforts so that now many of these programs, the peak in funding, are starting to overlap in the 2020s, in the next decade. And it's not just nuclear forces either. If you look at the rest of our acquisition portfolio, we have a number of major programs where their peak levels of funding are projected to occur at about the same time in the 2020s. If you just look at the Air Force's aircraft procurement plans, their long-term plans, and I don't mean to pick on the Air Force here, but The F-35A will be in full-rate production. The Next Generation Bomber, LRSB, it will be ramping up to full-rate production. The KC-46A tanker aircraft will be at full-rate production, and they would like to buy a new trainer aircraft, ramping up to full-rate production.
Okay, Mr. Harrison, I'm going to have to cut you off because I'm running out of time. I only get one more question, but thank you very much. And thank you all for your participation. I think this is an extraordinary exercise, and I'd love to see us as members of this committee attempt to do what you have just done. It would be quite a challenge. I'd like to focus one last 30 seconds on the F-35. And I'm more concerned than anything else on the cost of maintenance. And we do not factor that in when we build these sophisticated weaponry. And as I understand it, it's going to be about $19.9 billion a year, and $1 trillion over the lifetime of the program, just for maintenance. And maybe you could all respond to that in writing, because my time has expired.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not trying to flatter you, but I believe all of you are brilliant analysts, but you don't feed your families because you think lofty thoughts. You feed them because you're able to communicate well. And by and large, we are failing. This committee's failing. Anyone related to national defense is failing in communicating the problem we have to our policymakers and to the public. The real essence when it comes to national defense preparation has nothing to do with intent, because intent can change within 24 hours. We really look at the curve lines for strategy, capacity, and capability. As I see it, the problem we have is the curve lines for those who may want to do us harm today or in the future are dramatically going up, and ours are dramatically going down. The primary driver of that, in my estimation, is sequestration right now. And yet when we talk about sequestration, everybody on this committee would be against it, but we'd all have a caveat. Some would say, but I didn't vote for it. Okay, I'm in that group. Others would say, but we can't deal with it unless we raise taxes. Some would say, unless we remove it from everything else, unless we have a BRAC. You know the drill, you know. Taking all of that aside, using your best communication skills, not with defense speak, not A2AD defenses or readiness or any of those things that you have, what's the best message that we can use to communicate with other policymakers who might be sitting in Ways and Means right now, or who may be individuals across the country, to tell them the dangers to this country if these curve lines continue the way they are and we can't change them? What would you say?
Congressman, I guess I'd start by talking about not just the security that we have today in this country, but what's the security for our kids? That's something that affects every member of Congress, and it affects every one of us. What kind of country are we leaving in the future? And as you point to these trend lines, there's a perception of American weakness right now in the world, and that perception, I think, is growing. And how we overcome it, I think, really involves two things. One is we have to get our fiscal house in order. As Tom was talking earlier, in terms of being able to tap financial markets, our ability as a nation to go into financial markets and get whatever the heck we need, whether it's in World War II or it's in the next World War III, God forbid, rests on our fiscal foundation. How secure are we as a potential investment? And so that's critical. Fiscal rectitude is the foundation for everything else. And so I think that we would be very open to whether it's entitlements reform, revenue increases,
But Jim, you're covering the solutions. Tell me what happens if we continue the curve lines. Any of you guys?
Sir, I mean, we'll lose wars. Our people in uniform will die, and we as a civilian society will have broken faith with a very small number of Americans who go in harm's way to defend us. It is really that simple. You know, the chiefs talk about readiness statistics and all the rest of that stuff, which abstracts it to one level, but it, you know, that's what it comes down to.
Advance?
Yeah, to me, the strength of American power is on our economic prosperity, and that prosperity is based on a rules-based international order that is undergirded by our involvement in the global security. And I think that that's the biggest argument to me about why we need what we have.
Anybody else?
I would add to that particularly for the American public, we need to emphasize that the future of wars do not necessarily look like Afghanistan and Iraq. I think that for most people who don't follow these issues closely, that's what war looks like, and that's what the future looks like, and they don't want a part of that. And so I think distinguishing what the future environment is like, future threats, and making clear that they do not always require large-scale deployments of combat forces in irregular environments is very important. I think the American public responds to the need for American leadership in the world. I think that resonates quite well. And I also think, I hate to come back to this, but reforming the defense budget resonates. You know, my mother used to ask me, why can't the United States defend itself on $500 billion a year? It's an excellent question. If we started the budget from zero, we would probably allocate things very differently. But making a public case about how we spend that money and why those dollars are needed to protect U.S. interests around the world, to continue playing a leadership role, and to say that not everything looks like the wars of the past 13 years is an important step.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. You know, I've been sort of in and out. We're dealing with the education markup, and sequestration is haunting that process, which is, again, I think some of the more thoughtful people who care about our ability to advance technological capability in defense understand that education is also a priority that really plays into national defense as well. And that sort of, I think, goes right back to the question of, you know, when sometimes sequestration is talked about, it's sort of like viewed as this, you know, the 10 Commandments that we're all sort of trapped under. And you know, I was around when the 2011 Budget Control Act was passed. And when that was incorporated into the Budget Control Act, number one, you know, debt to GDP was closer to 10%, or deficit spending to GDP was closer to 10%. Today we're under 3%. And secondly, the history, the forensics of sequestration really go back to the 1980s. I mean, this language was almost done verbatim from the Graham-Rudman sequestration. And Phil Graham, the grandfather, the inventor of sequestration, he gave a speech in 2011 where you know, he reminded Congress that it was never the objective of Graham-Rudman to trigger sequester. The objective of Graham-Rudman was to have the threat of sequester force compromise in action. So in other words, I mean, the fact is we're not helpless here. I mean, we can turn off those cuts by an act of Congress, which the Budget Control Act, by the way, was as well. So, you know, this is, you know, I just think it's important sometimes for people to remember we're not sort of trapped here, that you know, we can do this. And Mr. Thomas alluded to, you know, some of the ways that we need to take a global approach. And the good news is that, again, because the deficit has moved in the right direction, far faster than CBO projected in 2011 when we passed the Budget Control. I mean, if you said that we would have the deficit down to less than 3% of GDP back in 2011, you would have been dismissed as a stark raving lunatic. And yet that's where we are today. So this is not mission impossible. And again, I just think that that's something that we all have to kind of keep sort of drumming into us. This is not something that we have to accept. One quick question, again, looking at some of the priorities that, again, you guys still went through this process, you know, sharpening your pencils. You know, I sit on Sea Power, and, you know, the Navy changes that you sort of suggested, certainly the undersea, you know, sort of bolstering of forces is something that some of us are, you know, feel pretty validated about. But there was also, again, the LCS program and the cruiser program seemed to be sort of a target in terms of some of your suggestions. And I was wondering if whoever wants to step up and sort of talk about that, you know, the floor is yours.
If you don't push the button, you don't get to talk. The sea services back in the 90s made a fundamental misjudgment about the nature of warfare in their domain, which we've been paying for. They thought they were going to be able to eternally operate close to shore. So the Zummel cruiser was basically like a giant battleship that had a gun that shot 100 miles, which is a pretty amazing bit of engineering. But, you know, if you can't sail close enough to use the gun, then it's a little bit of a problem. Likewise, the littoral combat ship, as the name indicates, was meant to fight in littoral waters. And it was designed to go fast originally. It was called the Street Fighter at one point. Well, so now we find that the environment in which it may be asked to operate is a lot more lethal, and thus it was a fundamental misjudgment by the Navy about what its operational environment was going to be that's affected a whole host of programs. And it's going to, I don't know, take a long time for the Navy to recover from having made that profound mistake. It's been a problem for the Marine Corps as well. And you could probably make similar judgments about the other services.
I'd like to just add briefly your comment about education and how that affects this. One of the things we prioritized in our team was preserving as much of the defense budget as possible for research and development, and particularly within that basic science, things that don't have yet a direct link to defense programs because of our concerns that the funding for that in other parts of the federal budget will be coming down, and that ultimately basic research and basic technological research is absolutely essential to stay on the forefront of defense capabilities in the future. So we prioritize that even within the defense budget.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to the topic that Mr. Forbes was pursuing, that is how we communicate this problem. Anybody on this committee knows that the spending caps that were put on defense through the BCA are moronic and need to be gone. The problem we have is many people in the Congress think it's working out just fine. Deficit's going down. They're not hearing the Defense Department squeal too much, and we're not dead. So we have the challenge as members of this committee to communicate not only to the public, but more importantly to our fellow colleagues and our leadership, the problem in a way that makes them want to act. You know, Mr. Courtney's right. We can fix this, but we've got to have consensus that it needs to be fixed. That's not there. So I would ask each of you, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Forbes asked you to, in plain language, describe why it needs to be fixed. You talked about we've broken faith and all that was fine. That's not going to persuade members to change their mind. What I think we have to do is offer that, but then follow it up with some specific examples of why this is a threat to our country's security. So I would ask you to use this threshold. Assume you're talking to my 75-year-old mother who never finished high school in that kind of language, and explain to her, who happens to be another member of Congress, why this has got to be fixed, and it's got to be fixed with this budget. Let's start with Mr. Donnelly and go down. And you got 30 seconds at most, because they're not paying attention after that. We're talking to them on the floor. They're wanting to get on to something else.
I can't believe that a woman like that would be content to send American soldiers into harm's way without preparing them for victory. I would not want to give up on that idea. I think that is something that touches Americans who don't serve very deeply.
But my colleague's going to say, listen, the Defense Department's not squealing. I think it's working out just fine. Tell me why it's a threat.
Because, look, part of the job of this committee is to make that case.
That's what I'm asking for help with.
You know, go out to a rifle range, go to a unit, go to a hangar and see pilots who aren't flying.
You're missing my point. I'm on the floor talking to a colleague from Wisconsin. He's giving me 15 or 20 seconds of attention before he's moving on. I'm asking you to help me have some examples I can provide. Mr. Thomas, you're shaking your head, and you know what I'm doing.
I'll try to redeem myself after Mr. Forbes' comment earlier. What I would say is that are we better off now as a nation than we were in July of 2011?
And he said, yeah,
before
our deficit's down.
Our deficit's down, but the world's gone to hell in a handbasket. And what I would say is the reason we have to fully fund defense today is because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we either pay now or we're going to pay much more later as we look at a deteriorating global
Y'all are
security
making a wonderful case to people on this committee who get it. You're too abstract. Give me some examples of why we should scare the crap out of somebody that if we don't turn this around, we're going to be in trouble.
So the last time we sort of ignored things and went down farther than most planners would have wanted us to go was the time we ended up in Afghanistan because we had not been paying attention and didn't have the capacity to and will to respond. Or maybe more currently, if you're speaking to someone today, you see the beheadings from ISIS on the news. Do you want us to be able to do something about that? I think that's the fundamental question. I mean, there are deeper questions buried in that, but I think that's the fundamental question we're sort of trying to face.
The world is a dangerous place, and we're dealing with more difficult threats than we have in a long time. And we have to be able to deal with the full range of threats, from a group like ISIL that beheads innocent people to an aggressive Russia that is invading, taking over territory from other states. The United States has a leadership role to play in ensuring those things don't happen.
Sir, can I try a completely different approach? Because I don't think the defense arguments are necessarily going to convince a person that hasn't already been convinced by them, because I think they've heard all of this. What I would say is the BCA budget caps were set without regard for need. They were set to reach a predetermined deficit reduction target. The BCA was intended as a forcing function, not as a means of governing. So I would say, with all due respect, Congress should do its job and govern and reconsider those caps and spend what is necessary for defense, not an arbitrary level.
Well, all of you make very good cases, but I'm just telling you, our colleagues don't get it. They really think they're working, and they don't see the harm, and this is dangerous. But thank you, Mr. Speaker, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. I've listened carefully. And Mr. Donnelly, you mentioned about entitlement funding and inferred that that is one of the reasons why we cannot fund our defense needs. And so my question is this. Defense spending, particularly sequester, are hollowing out our defense infrastructure and will leave us with a hollowed out military unable to meet the current and future threats to our national security. And but my question to you is this: what's worse, a hollowed out military and inability to respond to the current challenges to our national security and those that will arise in the future, most certainly? Or is it a hollowed out social safety net with millions of poor, hungry, and homeless children, elderly and mentally and physically ill Americans all clamoring and solely dependent upon private charity for their basic sustenance? Which is worse?
Both those things are bad. The worst case of all is paying for my entitlements. I'm not yet poor. I don't intend to become poor. And
you do realize that there are many poor people out there.
I do, but the entitlement...
You realize that...
But you're not talking about entitlements when you're talking about poverty. You're talking about the middle class.
You also recognize that... Hold on.
You're going to be paying... Social Security and other entitlements are going to be paying for my baby boomer retirement. I would sacrifice some slice of that to protect the poor and to give people who need in this society a decent quality of life, and to protect us all as Americans.
Well, certainly.
I think my slice.
I think most of us would agree with you. Most of us would have some affinity for the idea of perhaps removing caps on social income subject to Social Security taxes, those kinds of things that would strengthen our so-called entitlements. But you did not answer my question, though. What is worse, a hollowed out military or a hollowed out social safety net, which affects millions of poor children, elderly, sick, both mentally and physically? What is worse?
Okay, that's a false choice that I won't make. We're a wealthy society. We can afford to defend ourselves, and we can afford to take care of the people who need help in our society.
Well, I think your comments were indicative of wanting to just totally cut and obliterate the entitlement spending.
I said we were spending too much on entitlements. I didn't say that we should obliterate or eliminate the entitlement programs.
Current levels of spending on entitlement programs is too much, and current spending on defense is too little.
That in bottom line terms, I would agree with that.
All right. I just wanted to get you on record on that. I have, unless any of the other members of the panel wanted to respond, I would have no other questions. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our panelists today for joining us. Dr. Benishell, I'd like to go to one of the comments that you made specifically about base capacity. Your comment in your analysis is it's unconscionable to require these services to continue to spend money on facilities they don't need, while the budget caps require them to cut end strength, training, readiness, which puts American troops at unneeded risk. And looking at that, give me your perspective on how the analysis was done on current base capacity. What are some of the assumptions there? Was it different than the analysis that was done in 2005? And one of the issues that comes up is, not only looking at capitalization, but, how does this square with the national security strategies that we have and making sure that there is indeed alignment there? And another one of the most important questions is there is a cost to these base realignment and closure. If you can't capture those savings within the fit-up, then all of that is speculative about what impact truly realigning capacity has. So give me your assumptions about that analysis and about where we really need to be addressing this particular question.
First of all, that's exactly right about needing to be able to harvest the savings within a certain period of time, the 5-year FIDEP period. And in fact, that was the one defense reform type option that was available to us in this exercise, was what Todd dubbed and others have dubbed a clean kill BRAC, which is that all the savings as part of that would have to be generated within 5 years. I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the 2005 BRAC experience. I don't think anybody is happy with how that occurred. I would say that that process was much more about alignment than closure. There was a tremendous amount of new construction. The new construction costs reduced the planned savings for that by over 70%. So the 2005 BRAC model is not what I think that Congress should endorse. The previous BRAC rounds did a far, far better job of reducing costs and actually harvesting savings, even though some of it was beyond the 5-year period. That's what Congress should use as a model and not be scared off by the 2005 experience. I don't know the details of where those numbers came from within the services, but I do know that there have been efforts for financial reasons to shrink footprints, to consolidate, and some of it also reflects force structure cuts. And when you cut force structure and end strength, you don't need as many facilities as you have in the past, and I know that was one of the drivers of their cost estimates.
And looking at the national defense strategies, I think one of the concerns is that in haste to be able to save money, we look at the short term, but understanding too, just as you all have pointed out, that things change in the long term. And we know in the United States as it's configured today, if you get rid of base structure, you will never get it back in that configuration. And if you do need to regenerate that, it'll be much, much more expensive, and it'll be sometimes impossible to regenerate it because people don't want those things in their backyard anymore once they disappear. So the balance is how do we save money in an effective way to meet today's needs, but how do we make sure that we don't rid ourselves of capacity that may be needed in the future? And a great example is, let's say, theoretically, you want to close an Air Force base, but we're planning to put in place a new long-range strategic bomber, and all of a sudden, later down the road, as these aircraft start to come online in 2020 and beyond, you look at it and you go, wow, we close this base, but that's really a place where we need to be placing these long-range strategic bombers for a variety of reasons. We don't want them flying over neighborhoods, the sound, all those kinds of things. So my concern is aligning strategically long-term needs with where we're trying to go in the short term. So just give me your perspective on how those elements balanced in this decision-making.
I would just say that I believe the chiefs of staffs of all of the services are well aware of that. They do think long-term. They are not concerned when they make recommendations like that and estimates of that kind of capacity. They are not talking about what they need for today or even tomorrow. They are thinking much longer term. And if those are the conclusions that they have reached, that they have asked Congress for, that they are asking Congress to close 20% of their capacity, that will already have figured into their calculations, particularly because they're also involved, the Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force are thinking about the long-range bomber, for example, when they make those decisions.
Sure, I think that's why the questions about the assumptions that they make about needed capacity and whether that aligns with the strategies is such a critical question. I think those questions need to be asked if we're to make the proper decisions. And I don't know if any of the other panelists have a view on that and how we need to keep those things in mind.
Congressman, one thing I might add is we certainly have to be concerned about regret factors for closing domestic bases. But I think that danger is greatly compounded when it comes to thinking about our overseas bases. And there, I think the regret factors could be far greater.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question, just about, particularly because the American public obviously has a lot of concerns about cost in general and defense budgets and what have you. But help me understand, like, how do you, with all the aggression that we see popping up in different parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, but also in the Ukraine and other places, paying for all of the needs to address all of those different issues and be prepared? Because I think that a big part of preparedness is that even if we never have to use force, like let's say like in the Ukraine, for instance, we obviously want to have the appearance or the perception that we are prepared to deal with it if need be. And so how do you deal with all of these, with us having to keep up that perception and that capability at the same time and dealing with the money that's needed to do that? In particular, when we start talking about personnel costs, which is a big part of the budget.
Congressman, one thing I'd offer is that, as I've mentioned in my testimony, we have to think about new ways of deterring conflict abroad. And in the past, we've maintained very large, sizable forces in an expeditionary fashion that we can dispatch overseas to come to the aid of an ally very reactively after something has occurred. And we have an opportunity, I think, to make a shift. We can put greater emphasis on preventive capabilities and the ability to deny adversaries the ability to commit acts of aggression or coercion in the first instance. But we also can place greater emphasis on global surveillance and strike capabilities that can cover down on multiple areas of the world simultaneously and hold out the potential for very devastating reprisals should aggression or coercion be conducted.
I would add to that the United States has a tremendous deterrence capability today, especially if you're talking about things like Russian aggression in Ukraine. The U.S. Army, both the active component and reserve component, have a tremendous number of tanks, for example. The question about whether they're forward-based and whether they're reassuring to our allies is an important one, but that's not a question of the equipment. The equipment is there, the people are there. That's a basing issue and a force posture issue. The types of current threats that we're facing don't require large-scale conventional forces in order to address. They're more likely to be addressed by special operations forces, light footprint types of approaches that cost much less money in terms of equipment. They're expensive on the personnel side, but at least in the current threat environment, that's not a trade-off that you have to make within the defense budget. Now, as I said, our principles, when we went through this exercise, we're not convinced that that is the same logic over the long term. So our long-term investments shifted a bit in order to ensure that the United States maintains a credible deterrent force across all of its military services. But the capabilities to deal with the threats that we are facing today, in our view, largely do reside within the services.
If I may, I would say we have a problem more with dissuasion than deterrence. We have an incredible ability to punish anybody that we wish to punish, whether we were based forward or based in the continental United States. I mean, that destructive power of the American military is, literally awesome. The problem is to dissuade the Russians or whoever from crossing the line in the first place. And that is very much a matter of where we are and in what kinds of numbers. This is the problem, both in Europe and in East Asia. But the problem in the Middle East goes even beyond that, I would say. I've always been attracted to Jim's idea that we've been issuing eviction notices in the Middle East rather regularly over the past 20 years. What is our strategy for ISIS if not to evict them from their current statelet or whatever you want to call it? Anything less than that would be a strategic failure of huge magnitude. So, if our real goal is to not simply deter, but to dissuade a whole host of bad guys from even thinking about it, they have to think not only of the severity of the punishment, but of the certainty of the punishment and our ability to roll back, as it were, if they do cross various red lines. And that's where I think the immediate problem is. Nobody doubts the United States' ability to exact or to wreak havoc on our adversaries. What they question is our sort of willingness to do so, and our willingness to do so in a way that will be tolerable to our allies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Nugent.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today at the panel. I agree with some of what you say, and I disagree with some of what you say, but which is a good thing, right? We had a retreat yesterday, which was the first for this committee ever, and we heard from some, pretty insightful folks. Some was, classified, and some was unclassified. But at the end of the day, I think most of us walked away saying, we have the multiple of threats are so different. And we have state actors, and we have the resurgence of some state actors, Russia in one, and China now emerging. And our response, obviously, is worldwide, while theirs is more regionally allocated. So they can have, less money spent, but we have to spend a whole lot more to reach out and do the things we need to do, plus the counterterrorism issues that we have through non-state actors that are proxies for some states. So we have a whole host of issues to deal with. But your review, and Mr. Cotty, I think you touched on an area as it related to the National Guard and Reserve component. I think you were the only one that actually increased National Guard and Reserve, and I was just trying to figure out, why did you do that, and what was your basis behind that?
Sure. I think that when you start talking about getting down to these big budget cuts, one of the first things that you need to think about is the roles and missions question. What should everybody be doing? And I think that as we talk about the changing and diverse nature of threats, we need, and some of us have talked about the move away from how important conventional response is. Perhaps the Guard and Reserve can start to be a place where we start to develop these other capabilities. Maybe these are not people who are going to be out there in the front line in tanks, but they may be, maybe the cyber mission needs to move out of the active components and into Guard and Reserve, because that's how we can better access people that, they want to serve their country. They don't necessarily want to be in uniform on the front lines, but they have skills that they can bring. And I think that that's something that if you're going to have to start thinking about big cuts, you have to start thinking about big moves. So that was one area. I think another area where we were thinking about the Guard and Reserve is a better rotation base for doing some of the engagement overseas, or sort of short-term things, being involved in exercise and building relationships and having some of those language and cultural skills that might be harder to keep in the active services. And finally, one of the things that we did was we brought down the size of the Army significantly. And while conventional threats are less than they have been at times, or our conventional responses are maybe not as effective as they have been in the past, the ability to mobilize a large ground force is an important capability to maintain. And so while you lose some time and capability by moving it from active to reserve, it's still important to be able to do that if you have to. And so making sure that the Guard and Reserve are sized and also organized to work better with the
Guard and
active.
Reserve,
Yeah.
they do it at a reduced cost.
Yeah. Yes, that's. I mean, part of the reason we moved out of active into reserve is it was cheaper.
But they've been utilized to a greater extent than ever. The last 10, 13 years, they were never really, I don't think, envisioned to be that that operational, but they are today, and I think we have relied upon them to a greater extent. Here's what I worry about, and we focus on what's in front of us right now. The shiny object is ISIS, but it is much greater than that. Across the globe,
When you start trying to identify what the threat is, and it's radical Islam. It's those types of things that are not just in Syria and in Iraq, but they're in Africa. They're all over the world, and so we're focused on that. But at the same time, we have state actors that are increasing their capabilities to an extent that we've never seen before. China has never been a real threat to us. And I don't think they're necessarily a threat to the homeland, but they are a threat to our way of life, particularly in regards to what's going on, in the Pacific, and what they can do and what their modernization is designed to do. And we have to be able to project force to that, because I think one of the things that was mentioned, that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I just want to leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for an excellent hearing. I wish all of our colleagues were able to attend. I also want to thank CSBA, because it sounds like that budget exercise you went through was extraordinarily useful, not only for the expert panelists, but it made me wonder, Mr. Chairman, if we should get all the members of this committee to go through that exercise, because life is about trade-offs. Legislation is about trade-offs. And I thought Mr. Donnelly was particularly useful in his exercise in a traditional U.S. defense posture costing us $780 billion. Like, is anybody on the Hill talking about numbers of that size? And that's very useful, because your benchmark is kind of like traditional HASC speech material. So I would suggest that no member continue making that speech unless he or she is willing to find $780 billion. So we're more than a paper tiger here. Mr. Donnelly?
I just want to clarify with it. That's the difference between what we thought would begin to be adequate and what the 10-year baseline is. So it's about almost a 20% increase.
Yeah.
So it's $800 billion out of $2 trillion, something like that.
Yeah. So it's 4% GDP, which is a reasonable figure to spend on defense. But yet, we, even on HASC, who are more familiar with these issues, are nowhere near in the reality ballpark to get this done. Now, we perhaps don't need the traditional defense posture. The other panelists provide a useful service by getting even more realistic. But just in that ballpark, when Mr. Harrison said, well, for certain personnel measures, reforms that we probably won't have the courage to do on this committee, that would save us $33 billion over 5 years. Well, guess what? This week, this House of Representatives, in legislation so minor it won't even be reported in the newspaper, we will increase the deficit by $77 billion just by routine stuff that we'll do this week. $77 billion. Now, that's a 10-year figure as opposed to Mr. Harrison's 5-year figure, but these are approximate numbers. Just this week, we will blow through savings like that this committee will not have the courage to come up with. So I thought the single most powerful word in the testimony was Ms. Ben-Shahel's word, unconscionable. That's a strong word. And what was she referring to? The fact that this committee will not even allow the Pentagon to consider a BRAC reduction. When the Army and the Air Force testify there's 20% surplus capacity. That is outrageous. When our own military is begging us to get the flexibility to do the right thing, and we refuse to give it to them, we look incompetent. We look selfish. We look weak. And America should not look like that. So this is this committee's chance under new leadership to come forward with a realistic and funded defense strategy. On another note, Mr. Thomas, I wanted to ask, you mentioned a new strategy regarding sea mines and things like that. I would like to understand more about that. Aren't mining the seas considered an act of war? But that's a useful way to do A2 area denial?
Thank you, Congressman. What we have seen our adversaries doing over the last decade or more has been developing capabilities that can impede our ability to project power. Sea mines, as they sound offensive, are actually extremely useful defensive weapons. So you could imagine in places like the East China Sea, the ability for the United States and its local allies to be able to implant mines in their own territorial waters that could impede intruding submarines and other forces could be valuable for helping to better defend their maritime areas of control.
You've written about this, and so just go to your think tank and CSBA and get the materials on this?
Yeah, yes, sir. We'd be happy to send you something.
Mm-hmm. That would be great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, an excellent hearing.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison, you're as knowledgeable expert on defense budget as I know of in town, following it closely. Are you aware of any study or basis for this figure that some folks from the Pentagon throw around, that we have 20% extra infrastructure?
My understanding of that figure is, well, first of all, I believe DOD is prohibited from doing a detailed analysis of this issue, so they aren't able to produce new analysis to substantiate the number. The figure is an estimate that's derived from the detailed analysis they did of the inventory of facilities in the United States prior to the last round of base closures, and then subtracting the amount of infrastructure that was reduced during the fifth round of base closures. You end up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% excess capacity.
So sometime, as I understand what you're saying, sometime before 2005, they believe they had, and I don't know if these numbers are exactly right, 23% extra infrastructure. The 2005 BRAC round reduced 3%, so they are saying, okay, we still have 20% extra.
That's my understanding, sir.
That's where that number is based on.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. MacArthur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have lived through budgets for about 30 years in a very different context, in a business context, and I'm still trying to decide and discern to what degree that helps me and to what degree that hurts me in trying to assess our role and how we make progress in this. And I've presented budgets where I argued for my priorities. I've sat on boards of directors where I evaluated those and made cuts. It seems to me that our role is probably more like the board. I don't see us cutting individual programs, getting into the weeds. I think we lose something there. So I've been focused on the broader sense, and I'd be interested when I'm done in whether you think that's the right approach for us. It also seems to me the difficulty for us in assessing what level of military investment is adequate is a couple things I've jotted down here. One, the scope of the DoD is vast and arcane. It's so complex that only initiates, like the DoD, perhaps you, and others really get it. It's difficult to compare dollar levels to your mother. What's the difference between $500 billion and $550 billion? You know, what's the difference, really? It's hard for us to assess that. There's a myriad of different opinions. There's a third problem about the risks, the priorities, the relative effectiveness of options. And then there's a whole set of a fourth issue, differences in values. I heard a question earlier about, you know, is this more important than social programs? And you can argue whether that's a false choice, but it's a choice that's in many people's minds. So I've tried to stay focused on a little bit of a broader approach to this, and that is, what is military spending over time as a percentage of GDP in peacetime, in wartime, and where are we? Are we in wartime, peacetime? As you look, you know, it's not a World War II environment, but we're certainly a nation at war. And I'd like you to talk about it, but I'd actually like it if one of you could send analysis, if you have it, I assume you do. What have we spent throughout the course of modern history in military spending as a percentage of GDP? And then what level of DoD spending is implied by the current BCA as a percentage of GDP. So I'd be happy to have you grasp any of those points that I just mentioned and comment on them.
If you don't mind, if I can go first. I have a report, I'll send it to you, that tracks it, at least since the end of World War II, defense spending as a percent of GDP. I do not remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I believe the peacetime average, if you cut out the periods of the Korean War and Vietnam War, et cetera, that we have typically averaged around 6% of GDP. But also, if you look at the trend in the graph, it has been steadily declining, and that's over decades. I caution people against using percent of GDP as a good metric for defense spending. I think what that leads us to is setting things like an arbitrary floor for defense spending. People have floated things like 4% of GDP, 4% for freedom. It's great alliteration. I don't know that it's good strategy, though. I still fundamentally believe the reason I'm against the BCA budget caps is the same reason I'm against setting a percent of GDP for defense, is because I think our spending levels should be driven by our security needs and not set at some arbitrary level, regardless of where that ends up. Let's have the debate about what we need to spend, and then let's fully fund that.
If we could get some agreement around that, I would agree with you. But I'm not sure we can, and so in the interest of persuading colleagues who are part of this decision, it seems to me there needs to be something else, some handle for people to grab hold of and say, okay, we do have deficit issues, but if we've spent 6% traditionally, then maybe I can live with 3.5% today. That's why I gravitate a little bit to that.
I have failed to answer the last part of your question. We're on track now to fall below 3% of GDP on defense spending. That is where we are headed at this moment.
I'll try to put this in 15 seconds. Since the end of World War II, we have guaranteed a remarkably historically secure and stable international environment. It's been the framework for our prosperity. It's been the framework for the expansion of human liberty across the planet, and for a really if you're talking about great power stability, unprecedented in history. The cost of that has declined. As we have become richer, and the system has become more entrenched, which is reflected in that downward GDP slice. GDP is nothing more than a measure of the opportunity costs. Can we afford to sustain what we've built? And at 5%, a nickel on the dollar, it seems like a pretty good value and a cost that we could sustain, indefinitely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Davis?
I'll try, Mr. Chairman, really quickly. I've been called back to another meeting. Thank you so much. Your presentations were good. I read most of those before and have heard the questions. Mr. Harrison, if I could turn to you, because I know you've been very involved in personnel issues, and I believe the chairman asked about that earlier and, the cost factors involved. We have 1% of our population that engage in the military. And so part of the pushback as we move forward and try and deal with these issues is that very fact of people feeling like, we're looking at the budget, but, we're going to this area, and I greatly appreciate the commission. But I'm just, we were talking about how do we sell some of this? And what would you say, I guess, to that 1%? And what is it that we should be coupling particularly with those changes, that modernization, that we demonstrate that we're actually, being very true to the young men and women and the families who serve this country?
I would say that when it comes to the defense budget, it's about balance. And when it comes to keeping faith with the troops, it's not just about paying benefits. It's about ensuring that the force that we have and the funding we provide provides an adequate number of people. It provides the best equipment in the world that's properly maintained and the best training in the world. And we're breaking faith with the troops when we shortchange any of those things. So it's about keeping the right level of balance. And for me, when I look at the compensation reform issue, I served in uniform in the past, and I can tell you, and anyone who served I think would agree that it is not the only reason people join the military or choose to make a career of the military. It's not just about compensation. It's about serving one's country. So let's not forget that. But also, what's important to me is thinking about the future. I'm not in the military anymore, but what if one day my two little daughters, this is still a long way off, what if one of them wants to join the military? What will I care about as a parent at that point? I will tell you, I will not care one bit about their retirement plan. I will care about making sure they've got the best training, the best equipment in the world, and they've got enough people going into battle with them that they'll be protected and they'll be able to come back home to me. That's what I care about. And so I think when we're looking at, what we can do in the future, yes, we absolutely have to keep faith with the troops. And we absolutely need to maintain an all-volunteer force with a compensation system that can recruit and retain the best and the brightest. But it is about balance. So I think we've got to look beyond just trying to maintain the status quo.
Mm-hmm. And I think a few of the other issues that you raised, one is focusing on cyber, and that's understandable. I know that in the last budget, we actually did improve those budgets considerably. And on some levels, the technological piece and the intel piece is really dependent on the best minds. And so it's personnel, it's human capital that in many ways is required here. Why did everybody want to raise those cyber budgets significantly, and what should we know about that? Is it in competition necessarily with adversaries, and the idea that we can't stand still while they're racing ahead, or is it something else?
I think there is a tremendous amount of concern about proliferating cyber capabilities, particularly in the hands of some U.S. potential state adversaries and their capabilities. So I do think that there's a reason to be investing in that. I would caution, though, and I don't think the American people are aware of this, that most of the money that DoD spends on cyber goes to protecting and dealing with DoD networks. And dealing with offensive capabilities against state adversaries. They don't go about protecting, the networks that we depend on for our, banking, for, the fact that we all have iPhones in our pockets, the basic networks that undergird our society. I think there's an important role here for reserve forces to play, not just because they offer the chance to bring in people who wouldn't necessarily serve otherwise, but because you want the people who work at Apple, at Microsoft, at whatever, exactly. Startup tech company. You want the military to be able to address their skills, and particularly to be able to utilize their skills, and particularly if you're talking about the Army and the Air Force, you want them in the National Guard so that they can also deal with state preparedness for cyber emergencies and events that may occur as well.
If I may say, because I think you were pointing out the fact that those reserve forces and civilian have increased greatly, but that's part of the argument, that being specific about the talents that people bring in that area, maybe we should be increasing that a lot more.
I think it's important to bring in people who already have those skills. It's much harder to grow someone within the military force structure to do that than to bring in people with the outside expertise.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Budget Control Act passed in 2011. It held the sequestration provisions in it that have done such damage to national defense. For emphasis, I'm one of those that heeded the warnings and voted against the Budget Control Act. We were advised, the House Armed Services Committee in 2011, that if sequestration played out through the full 10-year period after everything was said and done, our military would have the smallest number of men and women in uniform since before World War II, Great Depression era numbers, the smallest number of operational naval vessels since roughly World War I, and the smallest number of operational aircraft in the history of the United States Air Force. That's 3.5 years ago. Today, do you have a judgment as to whether those projections are holding up, or they were exaggerations or underestimates?
My first reaction is actually I think we're getting there even faster than some would have guessed at that time. We already had a Navy and an Air Force that were shrinking as budgets were growing. I believe the Air Force is now trying to rebound from hitting their lowest point since their creation in after World War II this year. The Navy force structure that we have projected, even at the president's budget level, not even the BCA level, is bringing us far below where we have traditionally been as a Navy, and it's both the size and efficacy of those forces. We've shrunk them. They also have the oldest equipment that they've had, especially in the Air Force, as sort of an average age of inventory, and they are getting less time to fly, steam, drive, and train and exercise. So I think we've already seen a lot of those impacts probably faster than we would have expected.
If I could add one thing, I fully agree. We are rapidly shrinking the force, I think faster than many of us even expected. I think even when we were running this exercise, I think we thought that our cuts might have been too rapid, and yet it seems to be the track that we're on. The one thing, a caution I would offer is while, for many types of threats and many types of contingencies, the size and the capacity of the force matters and the number of platforms matters. And other contingencies, other situations, it's the capabilities that those platforms have that actually may be more important. So while we do see that our ship count in the Navy, just if you take an example, is far below where it was in the 1980s, it's a different mix of ships with different capabilities. The same is true of the Air Force, much smaller number of platforms, but I would argue that the platforms are a lot more capable. So it's a very complicated question when you're looking at the size and capacity of the force. You have to also take into account what are the capabilities of that force? What can it actually do? And I think that's a key role of this committee, is providing oversight to make sure that we've got the right set and the right mix of capabilities and capacity in the future.
Is it fair to say at the same time that our potential geopolitical foes' platforms or weapon systems are also being upgraded?
Or just changed? The other thing that I would say about our forces is they're really remarkably less ready. So it's not just a question of how capable they are, how many of them there are, but how many of them are prepared to go into harm's way on short notice. The chiefs recently testified that because of the little squirt of money they got in the Ryan Murray deal, the Air Force got up to 50% of its combat fleet being ready. The Chief of Staff of the Army reported a third of its brigade combat teams were ready. That was the high water mark of recent years. So if you ask how many units can we send to respond to a crisis who have all their gear, well-trained, all their people, and are ready to go, that's a small slice of a shrinking pie, an aging, pie with aging equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're looking at outputs rather than inputs, I think that's the sort of metrics that really frighten me much more, either than capacity or capability.
China has had double-digit increases in its defense spending for 24 of the last 25 years. That's a situation that we can't imagine sitting in this room for ourselves. And over time, just looking at those trajectories, this just presents a far greater problem for us as we look out a decade or more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for the excellent testimony today. My question, and I hope in this question I bring generational perspective. I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened, and in our world today, at no point in my lifetime did we have more hotspots and chaos than we do when we open the newspapers. I find that much of our discussion in Congress, unfortunately, focuses on the impact of the sequester with a snapshot of the present time. My challenge to you is, what is the snapshot of the future for my generation that's going to inherit the negative implications of the sequester if we do not change the trajectory? I'd like to hear what that snapshot is 10, 20 years in the future, how it affects the free flow of goods and services around the world, the tough choices our military is going to have to make, and whether we will be able to support our allies.
I'll just take a quick comment to that. I think that the worst case scenario is a continuation of actually some of what we've seen this year, which is the freedom of regional actors to start to take things into their own hands without fear of repercussion, which I think is sort of the harbinger of a breakdown of this sort of the international order. When we reach a point where we see all of these hotspots, the concept of regional actors being able to physically take territory. I mean, the last time that there was an annexation of land was Kuwait, and before that it was back in the 60s. I mean, this is sort of relatively unprecedented in the current time. And so if that is what the worst case scenario looks like, I think the hotspots only sort of exponentially grow.
Really, since World War II, we've taken for granted the international set of rules that everyone plays by, which are really underpinned by American defense capabilities. And as we look out over the next couple decades, I think it is likely that we're not only going to have challenges to that global set of rules, but in fact, there are a number of revisionist states, whether it's Russia and Europe and the Caucasus or Iran in the Middle East, particularly if it acquires a nuclear weapon, or China and East Asia, that are going to impose new rule sets, at least regionally and over time globally.
Suppose a couple years from now you were voting on an authorization of force requested by the president, and whatever scenario you can imagine, and you thought as a member of the committee that you were going to send people into harm's way who might not win, and that more of them would die than you felt comfortable with. That's not something that anybody since 9/11 or since the end of the Cold War has had to take into account. When we have gone to war, we've gone to the war with the expectation of victory and at a particularly low cost. So as you look forward to your long and no doubt distinguished career, that's the kind of proposition that you may have to wrap your head around.
And Mr. Donnelly, I want to follow up on that. My second question, I have the distinct honor of representing Fort Drum, which is home of the historic 10th Mountain Division, the most deployed unit in the U.S. Army since 9/11. And my basic question, I want you all on record, as we focus on the negative consequences of these devastating defense cuts, are our soldiers' lives at risk today and tomorrow?
Yes. I mean, and again, more so. I mean, war is a dangerous business. All kinds of, training is a dangerous business. We ask people in uniform to take these kinds of risks, but we also think that our responsibility is to send them out there with the prospect of victory and prospect of coming home in one piece. And living a decent life when they're not deployed.
Yes, I mean, a force that is not adequately trained and adequately equipped is going to be at far greater risk. And this is a real danger with the Budget Control Act and the imposition of the caps.
Yes, and I would add that we've talked a lot about the impact of sequester-level budgets, which is as distinct from sequestration, the mechanism itself. We talk about how bad sequester-level, BCA-level budgets are. I actually think the impact of sequester, particularly on those readiness questions and training, is even worse. So just highlight that in the future as we see where this budget goes this year.
Yes, the cuts to readiness undoubtedly increase the risks that our military personnel will face.
And the one thing I would just add is not only is it the amount of budget reductions that increases this risk, that would only be compounded by a failure to make strategic choices, because I think the way we spend our defense dollars is just as important as how many dollars we have to spend.
Absolutely, and as we seek to educate our colleagues of the importance of replacing the sequester and not gutting our nation's military, it's more than dollar signs. This is about our soldiers' lives at risk and our brave young and women who serve in our military. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to say that I appreciate these briefings. They're very helpful, especially to the freshmen that are learning quite a bit, and we're getting into this process. Maybe we've come from somewhere where we've got a little bit of knowledge about this, but the whole budget process is quite a bit. I want to talk about two things real quickly. One is in a time where we are deploying one-to-one in many of our cases. I know the Marines as a whole are about 1 to 5 to 1 right now. It's very difficult, and it's very difficult to maintain a force. Some of the force wants to be deployed, but when you start getting into a 1-to-1 or a 1.5 to 1, you start diminishing your force and diminishing what they're capable of, quite honestly. How much should we worry about that? How much should we worry about many of these divisions going out at such a high rate? And then secondly, and you can take these as a bunch, this is a totally different subject, but when we talk about the F-35 program, the F-16 has been out, IOCs, for about 36 years, the F-15 for about 43 years. We are going to have those two aircraft, those two fourth-generation fighters, for probably another 20 to 25 years in some capacity in the U.S. Air Force. At what point do we say the F-35 program is a leap ahead in technology that we just can't skip? You can't take 2 bites of the apple. In other words, you have to do that technology jump right now. In other words, if you don't do it in 10 or 15 years, if you try and take the next step, it's going to be hugely costly, and we won't be able to afford it at that point. So the Joint Strike Fighter makes sense. And maybe we can run down the road on that.
I would just start by saying in this exercise, no one actually canceled the JSF program. 3 of the 4 teams did reduce the quantity that we're buying, but I'll let them explain their rationales.
On both your questions, first, the rotation demands, the 1-to-1 and the 1-to-2 and 1-to-3s that we've seen should no longer be the rotation requirements of the future now that we're not sourcing 2 large-scale ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So those numbers are naturally going to come down. So the way that we've looked at rotation policies in the past, the way even that the services have thought about staffing themselves and modeling what units are ready to go is all going to be changing because we will no longer have that kind of rotation demand on our largest forces. The caveat to that is special operations forces and other specialized capabilities will continue to deploy at those rapid rates because that's where the demand is, and so there does need to be some caution there. But those larger problems, I think, will naturally reduce themselves because of we're going to be having fewer people deployed overseas. Second, on the F-35, exactly as was just said, I think the question is not whether we should have the F-35, but how many. I would make an argument that the leap ahead is not to the F-35. The F-35 is important, but it is a linear continuation of the succession of fighters that we've had. The real leap ahead technology is into unmanned, and there are very, very good reasons that the Air Force in particular should be exploring that. And I would argue for not investing additional funds in the F-35 as the leap ahead, but taking any harvested savings and investing that in the future of unmanned technology, which will be a true leap ahead capability.
On the first question, I would say that one of the things we do have to keep in mind is that while we are coming, sort of having a changing of our structure of rotating, I think that there is also greater demand on forward deployment worldwide. And that's something we'll have to keep in mind and keep an eye on, especially with any changes to capacity. I think that's one of the big issues. We need to be places to reassure, to have presence, to engage with allies, which I think is critical today. As far as the F-35, I think one of the undersold advantages that it provides is as the sort of network node that actually makes everything around it better. And then, in fact, that's sort of the multiplication to me that it brings to the table is actually taking the fighters that we are going to have for another 20 years, and when you start working them together, it actually vastly increases their capability, their survivability, and I think that's something that we can't sort of wait on.
To your first question, undoubtedly, if we're going to have a smaller force, we have to change what we're doing. We can't have unsustainable op-tempo, burst tempo, where you have 1-to-1 rotations. But that's going to drive you in one of 2 directions. Either you're just not going to be overseas because you don't have the rotation base. If you continue business as usual, the other alternative is a smaller force means we're going to have to be more forward stationed. And I think that probably is the right answer. And it's the right answer not only because we're a smaller force, but it's the right answer because the environments in which we're going to operate are going to be far more contested. And our ability in a crisis or in a conflict to simply flow C-17s and commercial aircraft into a theater or drop off ships in that theater with troops is just not going to be realistic. On the F-35 point, I would just echo Ryan's comments on how we think about the F-35. It is more than just a fifth-generation fighter aircraft. It is a node in a network. And in particular, I would highlight the incredible capabilities of the Advanced Electronically Scanned Array, the AESA radar, which not only is a sensor, but it also is a potential weapon in the future. So I think we have to kind of change how we think about this capability. That said, we are going to have to look at what the capacity of that force is going to be.
I'll be quick because there's not much time left. Anybody who tells you we'll never get another large-scale land campaign in the Middle East, you should go have a little lie down and, wait till it passes. Nobody ever wanted to do these things in the first place, but there's a logic there that's pretty compelling. If you do care about the balance of power in the Middle East, this is going to keep coming back up. The points that people have made about the F-35 being something fundamentally different than a fancier version of the F-16 are right on point. I would offer that it's not really a fighter, it's more like an armed scout. It can go and protect itself and find targets for other things to kill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Time, gentleman's expired. Let me see if y'all are comfortable in answering how much we should spend this year on defense. Given everything you know about the work that your organizations have done, the exercise we've been talking about, and just for reference, using the 050 numbers, we're at 521 this year. Under the BCA caps, it's 523. The President's budget request is 561. I'm not trying to influence you, but yesterday General Dempsey told us that 561 was the lower ragged edge of how much spending it would take to defend the country. So, based on everything that you've done and everything you know, well, let me just see if, and if you don't feel comfortable, I understand, but do you have a number for FY16 that you think would be an appropriate amount to spend for defense? Mr. Harrison?
Well, being from a think tank, I'll start with my caveats. What you want the military to do is the strategy that's laid out in the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance and updated in the 2014 QDR. If that's what you want our military to do, then I think, and the other caveat, if you're willing to accept many of the cost savings proposals that DOD's included with their budget, which do include some compensation reform proposals. If you're willing to accept that and cross your finger that some efficiency initiatives actually come true, then I think their number of $561 billion for the total national defense budget is probably about right.
His caveats were my caveats. I think that the key question is what savings do you harvest in other parts of the defense budget and the assumptions that go into that. But if you make those assumptions, I think that that's a reasonable number to be considering. But I don't have a lot of optimism that a lot of those caveats will hold.
And your reason for saying that is if we gain efficiencies or savings in parts of the budget, those savings and efficiencies need to stay within the defense budget, right?
Yes, that's part of it. It's also, and you will know this far better than we do, it is very, very difficult to achieve current year savings by looking at efficiencies and the kind of reforms we're talking about. You do need to have a much longer perspective.
Yeah, okay.
I agree. I do think, obviously, Chairman Dempsey going with the ragged edge at 561, it's hard to refute that. And the sort of the rumor has always been that, that they tried to come in significantly higher. I think that having some pressure on making sure that internal reforms do happen and that there is some rationalizing of say, civilian and contractor forces as the force changes, there needs to be some downward pressure. But I am concerned about some of that the risk is all in the other direction. The risk is in the money we're trying to bring back in from OCO, that are in the war funding, that really is now just about how we live day to day. It's part of what the military is doing. So between that, the past efficiencies and assumed future efficiencies, the 561 starts to jump to 580, 590 really quickly when you start thinking about exactly what it is we think we're paying for and need to pay for.
Just to underscore, we really need reform because the reforms are not just about treating the president's request as a floor for this year and saying, if we don't get the reforms, you potentially need more, but it's the long-term savings. And if we don't start putting these reforms in place, we have this problem year after year. And at the same time, if we do put the reforms in place, we get those accumulated savings sooner rather than later.
I would fall back on the report of the National Defense Panel, for which I worked as a scribe, and so I got to see the members wrestling with this question. And their answer was to say we needed to go back to the 2011 budget, the last Gates budget, as it's commonly referred to, which was the last time prior to the BCA that the department was allowed to do anything like budget building that was based on a strategy. And I think their observation was that the BCA has fundamentally changed everything since then, including the national military strategy as reflected in the defense guidance. So the question is, how reasonably fast can we get back to that Gates ramp? So based on where we are and what that Gates number is, something in the 560 to 570 range is probably as much money as the department can reasonably digest, even if you wanted to get back to Gates, say, by 2018 or something like that.
I don't remember the exact number for this year for Gates, but it's in the, I think, 580s or something like that would be what it would be. So, yep. Sorry? 638, sorry. It's always good to have a budget person on your right shoulder to remind you what the real numbers are. Last comment I would make, I appreciate what a number of you, including Mr. Thomas at the end, said about reform. My only point to you is it's not just about saving money. Reform is necessary for the agility we have to have in a very volatile, uncertain world. And so there's two goals of this reform, and we need to keep them both in mind. But y'all have done a terrific job of fielding our questions and also some of our frustrations today. I appreciate it very much, and as I said at the beginning, I really appreciate all of the work that your organizations do to contribute to our national dialogue and decision-making on defense. So thanks for being here, and please keep up the good work. I know I and other members of the committee depend on the work y'all do to help inform and educate us. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned.